Hello, today we're going to talk about Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. We're going to begin by talking about the background and time period during which this novel was written. So this takes place during the Regency era of English history, which took place between 1795 and 1837. And one of the features of this particular time period was the level of refinement that society went through. So you're going to see an increase in the refinement of fashion, for example, art and architecture, and especially in the way that people behave. So you've seen in the novel that the characters focus quite a lot on their manners and their breeding and all that kind of thing. And that is definitely part and parcel of the Regency period of England. The society during the Regency era is also very stratified, meaning that people of different social classes mixed very little. So someone of a lower social class and a higher social class probably are not going to have a relationship with each other. They're not going to live in the same parts of town. They want to be as little connected as possible during this period. So very, very highly stratified between social classes. The novel also ticks off a lot of Austen's trademark moves, and these are all things that were pretty unusual at the point that she started writing. So these are things that Austen does that are kind of avant-garde. So she's writing a novel as a woman for a female audience, and she has a female protagonist, a female heroine in Elizabeth Bennet. So this is also something that we wouldn't have seen before now, really. We also have the central conflict in the novel surrounding courtship. Which is what we would kind of think of as dating. But it's that effort by the female characters to find kind of security and happiness in a marriage. And that, again, is most of the plot of most of Jane Austen's novels. So let's return to this idea of social class, because this is a really big theme in the novel. Marriages during this time period are typically equal in class, meaning that the two partners are usually of the same social class. It was very unusual, even to the point of being kind of a scandal, if someone of a higher social class were to marry someone from a lower social class, like, again, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. Social class was also determined not only by oneself, but by one's relatives and connections. So, for example, if you didn't have a lot of money, but you had a lot of friends and relatives who did, that could kind of elevate you. So you can see that in Mr. Collins' behavior, for example. He is relatively poor, but by basically latching on to Lady Catherine and his other wealthy friends, he's able to kind of elevate himself a little bit. And the reverse is also true. So even though Elizabeth comes from a semi-respectable family, she knows that she can be brought down by her sister behaving badly, her mother behaving badly. So all of that is part of her own social status. I pulled some quotes for you that I thought were really important and illustrated these ideas pretty clearly. So the first section here is Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bingley, and his sister all talking about Jane Bennet, with whom Mr. Bingley is in love. So first we have Mr. Bingley's sister, who you remember is kind of a snob. And she says, "I have an excessive regard for Jane Bennet. She really is a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well settled. But with such a father and mother and such low connections, I am afraid there is no chance of it." So Mr. Bingley then comes in and tries to kind of take up for her. And he says, "I think I've heard you say that their uncle is an attorney in Meryton." So she's saying, yeah, Mr. Bingley's saying, wait, but she has kind of a highborn uncle who has a nice job in a nice part of town. And the sister responds, yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside, which is a really kind of low-class neighborhood. So she's saying, don't get excited, they have some very low-class family. And then finally, Mr. Darcy says, "It must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world," replied Darcy. So he's essentially saying, those relatives, their mother and their family really is hurting their chances of marrying anybody worthwhile. Later, the second passage I pulled for you is Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth having an interaction here. So they're kind of starting to fall in love. Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry, but there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner which made it difficult for her to affront anybody. And Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger. So Darcy here is thinking, it's a good thing for me that she has such low family and friends. Otherwise, I would really fall in love with her. So that social class is so important that for quite a long time, it keeps Darcy from admitting that he is in fact in love with Elizabeth. Next, we have the role of marriage in the novel. So marriage during this time period worked a little bit differently than it does today. So first of all, women were seen as kind of a liability to their parents, so women couldn't really bring a fortune to a family. It was more that the money went away with the children with the daughters when they got married. So an unmarried daughter is just going to cost you money forever until you can kind of offload her onto another man, but she's never going to bring money into your household. Dowries would often be attached to women to entice men to marry them. So if a woman had a very large dowry, so, let's say 10,000 pounds, that would make more men want to marry her because that money comes with her when she gets married. So you notice that the Bennet daughters don't really have much dowry, so there's not a lot to incentivize men to want to marry them. And finally, women are subservient in marriage. So this is pretty typical of the time period, but the women are very much not quite servants, but they're definitely under their husbands' thumbs. So they're in a position where they kind of have to wait on their husbands. So this first passage here is Mr. Darcy explaining to Elizabeth, it's Mr. Collins explaining to Elizabeth why he thinks that she should accept his marriage proposal. He says, "My situation in life, my connections with the family of De Boer, and my relationship to your own are circumstances highly in my favor. And you should take it into farther consideration that in spite of your manifold attractions, it is by no means certain that another offer of marriage may ever be made to you. Your portion is unhappily so small that in all likelihood it will undo the effects of your loveliness and amiable qualifications." So he's saying to her, he's offering to marry her, but he's really also insulting her at the same time. So he says, you should be happy that somebody with my situation is offering to marry you, because even though you're attractive, you don't have any dowry. So, there's no guarantee that anybody else is going to even want to marry you. So he's sort of, again, trying to woo her, but he's also really insulting her at the same time. And then later on, Elizabeth is thinking about Mr. Collins, and she says, "Mr. Collins, to be sure, was neither sensible nor agreeable. His society was irksome, and his attachment to her must be imaginary." And here Elizabeth is thinking about Mr. Collins marrying her friend, Charlotte. But still, he would be her husband. Without thinking highly of men or of matrimony, marriage had always been her object. It was the only honorable provision for well-educated young women of small fortune, and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. So Elizabeth is thinking about Mr. Collins and how ridiculous he is, but also, he's going to marry her friend, and even though it's distasteful to her, in fact, she calls it irksome, it's still really the only way out that she has. And so I think she's maybe here kind of doubting her decision to turn him down for just a moment. So finally, I wanted to talk about our views of women in the novel. So we have this idea of purity and virginity being paramount amongst women. So very often in the novel, women are complimented for their modesty, which was a very big deal. And of course, the whole scandal with Lydia Bennet running off unmarried with a man almost ruins the entire family. So just one daughter being quote unquote impure would be enough to drag the whole family down. And then secondly, there's this idea of ruination, which again is what Lydia's elopement would have meant for the family. And once a woman is ruined, meaning that that was their word, not our word. Once a woman is quote unquote ruined, she could never be married to anyone worthwhile. And it also throws shadow on her whole family, meaning that none of her sisters could ever be married to anyone worthwhile either. This first passage I picked for you is the moment that Elizabeth has discovered Lydia's eloping, And she's unfortunately discovering it in front of Mr. Darcy. So they've been really kind of falling in love and getting closer, and at this moment, it's all starting to fall apart because of Lydia, her sister. Elizabeth thinks her power was sinking. Everything must sink under such a proof of family weakness, such an assurance of the deepest disgrace. She could neither wonder nor condemn, but the belief of his self-conquest brought nothing conciliatory to her bosom, afforded no palliation of her distress. It was, on the contrary, exactly calculated to make her understand her own wishes, and never had she so honestly felt that she could have loved him as now, when all love must be in vain. So what she's saying here is that as she is basically freaking out because of this news about her sister eloping, Mr. Darcy is really calm and sweet. It says that he was kind of holding himself together. And she says, this particular reaction made her feel more than ever that she could have loved him. And that was terrible for her because now there was no chance of the love whatsoever, she believes, because her sister has ruined the family. The second passage is Elizabeth's sister, Mary. And if you remember, Mary is kind of pious and religious and talks a lot about women being chaste and modest. And so Mary says, unhappy as the event must be for Lydia, we may draw from it this useful lesson, that a loss of virtue in a female is irretrievable, that one false step involves her in endless ruin, and that her reputation is no less brittle than it is beautiful, and that she cannot be too much guarded in her behavior towards the undeserving of the other sex. So this idea, while it kind of sounds ridiculous to us, maybe, was really the law of the land almost in that day. So there's this idea that a woman's reputation is all she has, and that once it's lost forever. It's irretrievable. So anything that you do that is not seen as modest can throw your whole life into ruin, basically. Finally, I wanted to leave you with maybe some themes of the novel that might stick out more than others. So first of all, we have this idea of impressions versus reality. So this is where we get the title from, maybe Pride and Prejudice. When Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth meet each other, they have very bad first impressions of each other. Mr. Darcy thinks Elizabeth is kind of low-born and low-class, and Elizabeth thinks Mr. Darcy is a stuck-up snob. And of course, they, throughout the course of the novel, learn that they were both very wrong. So definitely there are some issues with that, with first impressions versus reality. And then we also have the idea that a lot of the people who are high-born and should be very noble and gallant, like Lady Catherine or Miss Bingley, are actually kind of terrible people. So social class does not necessarily define reality. Next, we have this idea of the constrictions of social class. So despite being very intelligent, very intellectual, Elizabeth is mostly prevented from marrying into high society because of her social class. And it's really kind of a lucky thing for her that she does. But social class keeps people very, very separated, and you can see what a big deal it is when Lady Catherine steps in at the end to prevent the marriage. So it's such a big deal that Lady Catherine is worried it could ruin her family for Mr. Darcy to marry down. Number 3 here, we have the dangers of pride. So the idea of being overly proud, as perhaps Mr. Darcy might be, means that he loses out on a lot of things. And he learns throughout the novel that he has lost time and almost lost the possibility of being with Elizabeth because of his pride. And finally, we have the reoccurring theme of women's precarious lot in life. So as we saw in the previous slide, Mary has that passage where she talks about how easy it is for a woman to lose it all. Even one kind of loss of modesty or reputation really means ruination, not only for a woman, but often for her whole family. So all she can hope to do is never to slip up and to marry well, and that is really her only chance of a happy life at this time. So Austen is definitely addressing that difficulty and that restriction. If you have any questions about Pride and Prejudice that I haven't addressed here, feel free to send me an email.